Okay, welcome. Welcome to this workshop, A Necessary Roadmap for Positive White Anti-Racist Lives. My name is Shelly Tochluk, and I want to thank you for taking time to watch this video. I am joined today by two colleagues to allow for some dynamic exchange during our time together. I'd like to first introduce David Camp, author of the White Ally Toolkit. David's role is as something of a discussant at a few points within the workshop. He is going to offer reactions and questions and some of his own insights. He's hearing this presentation for the first time along with you, so I will be curious what he has to say. David, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hello, folks. It's grateful to be here with Shelly. I love her work, and I'm happy to help add value to your experience.
Thank you, David. Second, I would like to introduce Ryan O'Leary. Ryan is sitting in as a participant today. She's been working with this material for a while, and I find that she asks really great questions about its application. Ryan, would you like to say?
Hello, I'm Ryan. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So to get started, I would like to take a moment to invite all of us to do something of a grounding, just to become conscious of where we are sitting, how we are sitting, how we are moving with our breath. I'll invite you to take a couple of slow, deep breaths. Just notice how your body feels, what kind of energy you're bringing to this workshop viewing today. Noticing what is crossing your mind, what might be coming along with you from the other parts of your day. I invite you to invite those thoughts to maybe take a back seat for a while so that we can all just pay attention to what is in front of us for this next bit of time. And I also want at this point to do a land acknowledgement, naming specifically, I am recording here in Los Angeles, which is the unceded territory of the Tongva people. And I invite you to consider whose land you are on as you watch this video today. I also want you to consider whether you are watching this video alone or in community. If you are in community, consider these offered community agreements. You may wish to read them along with folks, pausing the video in order to actually discuss the community agreements, if that makes sense for you. Some that I enjoy using with people include choosing authenticity over comfort, embracing messiness and kindness, being aware of equity of voice, listening with the same passion with which you want to be heard, and honoring subjectivity versus objectivity. Getting started, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. Since 2005, much of my work outside of my home community has revolved around the book Witnessing Whiteness and its associated workshop series, which is available free on my website. Many UU congregations and school faculties and community groups have used the free workshop aligned with the book to build a shared foundation of understanding about our personal relationship to whiteness. My personal anti-racist community is Aware LA. This is the community that keeps me learning and growing and taking anti-racist action. Because Aware LA as a white affinity organization has been so instrumental in my growth as an anti-racist person, an article that was critical of white anti-racist organizations that was published in 2017, well, it inspired me to write a piece that's published on Medium called On-Ramps and Lanes on the Racial Justice Freeway. It argues that all lanes, all contributions to anti-racism are important and valuable. And I tell you this because all of this put together reflects that for about 15 years worth of time, my focus was primarily on people who already see themselves as anti-racist, but kind of needed to do a better job of it. A big shift happened for me in 2017, though, when I started paying attention to the opposite side of the freeway, the rise of white nationalist groups. I began studying the way they offered belonging and purpose and community to white youth. I noticed their finely honed manipulation in their online videos and in their posts, and the way they exploit a weakness within anti-racism. And that's part of what we're going to be exploring today. And what happened is all of this prompted me to partner with a colleague and the Western State Center to produce a free toolkit. And that helps caregivers as well as teachers to interrupt white nationalist recruitment with the people in their own lives. And so all of this here has led me to this, which is objectives and goals for our time together. First objective is to identify two what I think are key weaknesses in anti-racism that give the far right an opening to draw white people toward them, to explore dynamics and competing messages that lead white people to distance themselves from racial justice efforts, and to share how the promise of a positive anti-racist white identity can be helpful. Also, in terms of goals, I hope that participants, viewers, will recognize how the racial identity model can be a supportive navigational tool, and hopefully to use insights to more effectively engage with white people, drawing them closer to anti-racism and social justice. So that's the big idea for today. And what I'd like to start with is one of the key challenges. So one of the two key challenges is the way that we approach white identity. In the battle for the hearts and minds of white people, there are, four different approaches that white people tend to approach racial identity with, and I would like to talk about them right now. The first one is sort of a color blindness orientation. This is most characteristic of people very early on in the racial identity process, but the idea is here that race isn't supposed to be meaningful to us, and we should just ignore it. We should not try to build an identity around being white at all, and it's just not something to be worried about. The second sort of camp is the one that none of us wants to be in, which is the white supremacist camp that says being white is the absolute best, right? We can see the inherent problems with that one right off the top. There are two other ways that identity is approached for white people, and it is these two down here. One is a white abolitionist approach, and you may not know that language. It comes kind of out of the 1970s. It's a sociological approach, often thought of as Noel Ignatev's theory that white people need to be traitors to their race. And there's an entire set of orientations that really fit together to come to the conclusion that being white is just an irredeemable concept. There's no point in identifying as white. In fact, we should just make the entire thing go away. And we often see that with people who name people as so-called white people or putting quotes around white as though it's just not a real thing. So there's no point in investing in it. This is different than the colorblind approach, but it still serves as a way of saying I am anti-racist, and I'm so anti-racist that I want all things related to being white to go away. Different option, quite different than the sociological approach just named, is offering a positive white anti-racist identity. This is much more foundational in terms of psychological theory and developmental theory. So it's been more popular among K-12 educators over time. And here the idea is it's okay to be a white person. Question is, how are you going to be a white person, right? It's about a developmental process to become the kind of white person who is anti-racist and functionally supportive of anti-racist efforts in doing so. So because these bottom two positions are both anti-racist positions, what we need to consider is how each of them are functioning in society today. We have a long history in the last 10 years where the white abolitionist position has ultimately started to receive far more oxygen. And I would say in social media, it has really taken over the common narrative about how to approach race and identity in the United States. And it's almost fully eclipsed the conversation and the language around the positive white identity narrative. And so the challenge I would like to offer to you is that this particular language of the white abolitionist, which is, being white is irredeemable, it really is a challenge for people who are in the colorblind state. These two do not go together well at all. And a lot of the language that comes from this section really scares folks in this section. And so this is just one thing to consider that we will get more fully into as we go forward. Oops, wrong direction. Let's go this way. Here's the second key challenge, which is that in most racial justice circles, white people is very, very often conflated with whiteness. And my suggestion is that if we don't make a clear distinction, when white people hear that we need to dismantle whiteness, for example, especially people in the colorblind zone, hearing from people in the whiteness is irredeemable zone that we need to dismantle whiteness and everything associated with this, many of those folks believe that white people are being considered the primary problem and that we will be continuing to be the problem as long as white people are in existence. And unfortunately, because people don't make this distinction between white people not equaling whiteness, but not equaling a system that benefits white people, what happens is that we again end up pushing people away from the conversation. And so these two issues named, that how we treat white identity is meaningful and the conflation of white people and whiteness. Well, the challenge here, and the reason this is such a big, important thing, is because in the last few years, race has become a lot more meaningful in white people's lives. This makes a big difference. And the reason this is making a big difference is because of the rise and the success of the BLM movement. It's because the national conversation on white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility has become so broad. It's because the rise of the far right and the white nationalist hate groups have succeeded in shifting the Overton window. That's their language for wanting to expand the way that it expands the ability to have conversations on their terms in the public marketplace. So what is acceptable and allowable now is vastly different than it was, 5-10 years ago. And because all of that is true, white people who typically aren't paying attention either to anti-racism or to the far right, who are just sort of movable middle folks, are watching the language that's coming from either and deciding that both are extreme. And it breeds a sense of either disengagement or apathetic approach that is making people more susceptible to those far right claims, unfortunately, and a certain sense of being repelled by anti-racism itself. And so what we hear are people who we might see as being sort of in the movable middle, in the people who, in the groups who aren't paying close attention, basically believing that both sides are equally problematic, that they're taking on the false claim that anti-racism is based in shame, that it never allows white people to feel good, and that nothing positive or inspiring for white people even exists within anti-racism. Now, my experience in anti-racism is that this is not the way I've lived. This is not how my community has handled white identity. And so I think that we need to do a big pushback about this, because I think that as long as this is in play, what it does is it allows anti-racists simply to offer moral and guilt-based arguments if they can't offer a more positive approach to white identity. So with that as sort of setting the context of what my concerns are, I am going to pause and invite our discussant and our participants to basically share what their thoughts are. But before I do that, I'm going to invite you to pause and just think about what I've offered so far and how it lands for you. And so I'm going to give about 10 seconds of silence to invite you to actually come to your computer and press that pause button. And if you're alone, maybe take 5 minutes or so to do a bit of a journal and just think about what I've offered so far. If you're with other folks, have some discussion on these questions, and then we'll get back and move forward. Ryan, how does what I've named resonate for you so far?
It makes sense with what I've seen in myself, and also what I've seen like in my work with how I'm trying to have conversations with people. I remember telling you one time that I did the thing. I did the I'm not white. White is just a social construct. I'm not white anymore, or something like that. And you helped me say, okay, hold up, think about it a different way. And so I remember that clearly. I find it interesting. I have seen very clearly how when my friends, my anti-racist friends, come off too harsh, too shaming, too not loving enough, I hear people equate us with, just as problematic as the other side. So yeah, I mean, it all rings true to me so far, and I see the challenges and the frustration, and I feel it.
Thanks, Ryan.
So I would add that I think your analysis is really helpful. And I want to build on what Ryan said and also add something else. I think that we will come back to the issue of being harsh and non-loving, because that's a tone question, which is a vital tone question when you're trying to invite people to new thinking. So that's true. And what you're talking about, Shelly, is more fundamental, which is like people are the whole whiteness is bad. Is there's a tone, and even the substance of it is a problem, even if the tone is nice. And the problem is when you say that people need to be, whiteness needs to be gotten rid of, that is highly aligned with the whole rise of great replacement theory, right? Which as you said, is now within the Overton window, which is a whole set of thinking that is promoted on Fox News by Tucker Carlson about how they're trying to get rid of you. Well, that's highly aligned with people on the left saying we got to get rid of whiteness, right? So especially when that conflation happens. So I think that your analysis is brilliant as usual, and we need to build upon it. And I love the fact that you're offering people an alternative way of thinking about it. So it resonates deeply, and I've thought for a long time it's all about setting up for white people. You can be a good white person. You just got to be a good white person. So the question is, how do you do that?
Thank you. Ryan, do you have any additional reflections just before we go on?
I do remember when you said about white doesn't equal whiteness. That's so hard for people who I'm trying to talk to. They don't understand, and it's probably best for me sometimes it's best for me to be careful with what words I'm using, because I understand what whiteness is, but the people I'm talking with, trying to help them see what I see, yeah, I just need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, and that's really where we're headed with this. This is why we kind of need, and I'm saying we as people who want to advance the effort of anti-racism, right? We need basically guideposts to help us interpret what is going on both within us and around us, and within other people, as well as direction, which to my mind, that is like a vision for where we're headed, like collectively in terms of race identity. Something that is positive, encouraging, and provides inspiration both to ourselves and to other people, kind of like a beacon of hope that can keep ourselves dedicated to anti-racism, even when it's hard and messy, but also is a point where we can deliver that message to other people so that they can see there's something positive that they can head toward as well, to actually invite them in. And so here's what really I think speaks to the issue of where people are and how do we know. And this is the part that I really want to offer today, is this tool that is this workshop proposes is coming out of white identity development theory, and I'm calling it the roundabout. It's an extension of the work of Dr. Janet Helms, who's there on the top, and Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Dr. Helms actually is the originator of this theory, and Dr. Helms is the one who really popularized it with her book. Both of these women have tried in great effort for probably 30 years now to try to get those of us who are white and are using their theory to stop thinking about it like a ladder, where we start at one place and then we consistently move up the ladder and then we reach the pinnacle and then we're wonderful people. Like, that is not what it is meant to be. And yet it's really hard in our linear thinking to not think of it that way. Even just up until a couple of years ago, Dr. Helms has been on podcast recordings with a different idea about how to talk about it. And she has been talking about frames, kind of like glasses, like lenses that you put on, that you see the world through a certain set of lenses. So at one particular position, things might look a certain way. At another position, it might look a different way. And that you can swap out these lenses over time and you can swap them back and forth, you know? That's a little bit like, but a little bit different than Dr. Tatum, who has talked about it not as linear, but more as like a spiral. So we're kind of maybe on an upswing. We end up hitting different positions at different points in time. And it's in different places at different time. It might be easier at different points in different time. And that's a great effort too. Like, each of them is more complicated, right? And it still doesn't capture the complexity, because white racial identity is really dynamic. And so a partner and I have been working to develop this roundabout idea that is intended to capture even more of the dynamics that happen. So here are a few things that it allows for. One, think about this like a roadway. So you notice all of these little, touch points in the middle there. This is like a very, very messy lanes that are not clear, and it's like tracks that we can go around. As we go along, let's just say that we have started in a contact position, and notice that we can end up going into a secondary position, but we can circle here for a good old long time. There's nothing in this theory that says we can't circle somewhere for a month or several years. But it also leaves room for, if we have the proper supports, to get out of a position and actually skip another one or two and actually get into a different position and come in and out, so that we can be learning and then getting disrupted, and then we can be learning and then we can be getting disrupted. It allows for that kind of dynamism, but it also allows for us to be learning and growing and whatnot, and then get bumped off course and end up in a place where we really don't so much want to be. But then we can get ourselves back in gear. What it doesn't allow for are parking lots. What it doesn't allow for are rest areas. This is a dynamic roundabout that basically says we are always in motion. There is always some aspect of how we are seeing the world that is active and operative. And now it may be dynamic and moving and changing, but if we can recognize what are the key features of how we're seeing the world, we can figure out, well, here's where I am. Where do I next need to go, right? And so it retains that idea of the spiral from Dr. Helms, because in fact, when we do, from Dr. Tatum, because when we do start to recognize, I've been here before. I know what this feels like. That's what this is. I'm here again. I have more skills. I can get out of it a little bit easier than the last time because I've been there before. But at the same time, as I'm circling, I can still get bumped off course. And then I need to work to get back in here. So with that, with this particular model, I think it gives us a great opportunity to gain insight into what's going on for our colleagues and our friends and even ourselves when we end up operating out of the early positions. Okay, so I want to give a little bit of an orientation to the first earlier positions, so that we can talk about, hey, so how can we best make use of our knowledge to support people? So here's a little bit of a tour. So contact is considered the first status. And this may be where most of us begin, but maybe not all of us. If you were raised in an explicitly anti-racist household, you may not have had years worth of contact like I did. I probably didn't get knocked out of the contact status for the first time until I was in high school. Some people don't get knocked out of contact for the first time until they're in their 20s or their 30s. I would suggest a whole lot of people got knocked out of the contact status in 2020 in the summer with George Floyd's murder. This position is one of relative naivete. It is having a lack of racial consciousness. It is deeply invested in the colorblind narrative, where we believe that, you know, if we would just stop talking about race, everything would just be better. And in fact, we are over this, and it's really the people talking about it that are the problem. But in fact, people who are in contact typically have something of a naive curiosity about people of color, but don't really have any strong relationships, haven't really come into contact with any significant racism that they've had to witness in their own lives. And so it's a relatively not clear perspective. But then something happens. Something happens and we get knocked out of contact. And the next typical place that we land is disintegration. And disintegration is exactly what it sounds like. It is the psyche being deeply disrupted. The part that's new about this model is that you notice that in disintegration, there are actually two circles. And the two circles, this bifurcated nature of disintegration, is because at each point, our psyche is striving to figure out, where do I land? How do I navigate this disruption? I am now seeing something that is racist. I am recognizing that racism is going on, and it's disrupting my world. It's that place where when you hear somebody say the world got ripped out from under me, that's what this place is. This is when we are confused and conflicted, and we're running against some moral dilemmas where we think everything is supposed to be equal and everybody has the same freedoms, but yet we recognize, well, that maybe that's not wholly true. We hear that everybody is loving and kind in our community, and then we find out that our community actually isn't treating everybody with loving kindness. So what do we do with that? We're trying to figure it out. And so in the disintegration place, we are either coming to understandings that push us further toward anti-racism, starting to recognize that racism is real, or we start to fall back into the status quo, because when we are disintegrated, the majority of the people in our environment are our family and friends. And if they were our white family and friends from before, they are still just as committed to the status quo potentially as they were before. And so we have a lot of pull toward reconstituting our psyche in the way and in the narrative that had been prior to the disruption. And so this I consider a primary place where, for those of us who want to pull people further toward anti-racism, this is where we want to catch them. We want to catch them so that we can help support people to land on the side of anti-racism and then move toward a reintegration that moves people into further identifying as anti-racist. But that doesn't always happen, because what happens is when someone is landing further in disintegration toward, well, maybe that thing I'm seeing isn't really what I'm seeing. Maybe these interpretations of it being racism is really that those people are not really as responsible as they should be, for example. Maybe they're actually the ones to blame, and all of that thing I just learned about is really kind of nonsense. If the person lands long enough in those positions, then it starts to turn into a more reintegrated psyche of reinforcing whiteness. So this is the retreat into whiteness. Notice here just the way the picture works. These two forms of reintegration, either reintegrating into and toward anti-racism, or retreating into whiteness, they don't touch. And there's a reason they don't touch. They don't touch because you don't cross back and forth between these easily. In order to make a strong move, you got to go back into being disrupted. So my theory if we're taking the last few years into account, is we had a lot of people who were not paying attention to race whatsoever, fairly naive about it, very invested in colorblindness, realized, okay, George Floyd was murdered. That's not okay to have someone murdered in our streets. So I'm seeing racism for the first time. And yet, as the summer rolls on and more complicated speech is happening around what it really means to be anti-racist, and this is what it means to have a platform to support Black Lives Matter, and all of the language that's coming out of more whiteness is irredeemable perspective, what we are getting is a lot of people who are getting a lot of pushback that says, wait a minute, that's going too far. Actually, if he had only, that part's wrong, but all the rest of you are way too extreme, then we start to get reintegrated into whiteness. And pretty soon, no, actually, white people are actually the ones who are more discriminated against, right? And we see people shift. The challenge with reintegration, and this is the third stop, is that reintegration is a more solid location. We've had some experience. We've been thoughtful. We made a decision in some ways. So getting someone to make a decision to believe they themselves are going to be anti-racist is important, because the other opportunity is absolutely not in the anti-racist or the real problem. And the white people are the most discriminated people in reality. I think we lost a lot of people at the end of the summer of 2020, but we also gained a lot of people. And the trick is that we gained a whole lot of people who ended up in reintegration toward anti-racism, which is also a really hard place to be in. It's actually a position that is marked primarily by deep feelings of guilt and shame and upset and anger at white society. And so when we think about the messages that people in reintegration, even toward anti-racism, deliver to people in disintegration and deliver to people in contact, we recognize there's some pretty challenging dynamics going on around here. So I'm going to stop there, pause for reflection again. I'm going to invite everybody to pause. I'm going to invite everybody to think, what has been your experience with these three positions: contact, disintegration, reintegration? Where have been your travels? And if you are not a white person watching this, what has helped you understand what people have gone through that have been in your life that you've witnessed? Where have they been that you've been able to tell? And what has maybe helped them or those people that you know move through these different positions? So again, I'm going to pause for about 10 seconds so that you can get to that button, and pause for about 5 to 10 minutes. Ryan, what do you think?
So that brought up a lot for me. I remember the first 47 years of my life going, having little teeny disintegration moments and reintegrating into whiteness and denying racism and saying, oh, well, no, that wasn't really what that was, or blaming it on something else. And I remember that clearly. And then when George Floyd was murdered, yes, my world fell apart. And I had so much guilt and shame and anger for months. And during that time too, like I was crying every day for months. Just so mad at the people who had taught me, growing up, and just really feeling guilty and ashamed at all the harm I had caused in my 47 years. And wow, it was super tough. And what I love is also remembering now how I've had little disintegration moments since then that don't last 2 months, that don't make me cry every day for 2 months. And so that feels good to know that I am more skilled, just like you said. And then what helped me move through those moments was support. that I got from finding aware, from my sister who she had already seen racism before I did. And so she was a person in my life who I loved and trusted, who I could, who helped me realize, okay, yes, this is real. And because I did so much on social media, and I don't recommend that, but in that I gained a Black woman who befriended me, who said, okay, you're trying and I'm going to help you. And that was huge too. And then meeting you, Shelly. But when I think about how someone I know has moved through these, I can see changes in my mom and my husband that have happened. And I think it's because instead of me being angry at what they say or whatever, when I can be supportive for them, and we've already mentioned loving and not harsh, and when I can not judge them harshly for saying what they say or thinking what they might think, they end up getting curious and coming out on the other end with something different than where I thought they were going to go, more towards what I'm trying to show them. So yeah, this is all very real for me. And I totally see it in my experience.
Okay.
Really appreciate this model, Shelly. And yes, Ryan, as a person in one of my workshops said, it's always important to get curious, not furious. So that's an important thing to remember as we're trying to figure out how to interact with people. And I would add one more thing, and that is in my workshops, in my extended ones, I sometimes poll people on questions that have to do with shame that they feel. And my finding is that usually in a White Ally Toolkit workshop, usually about a third of the people have a significant feeling of shame. So I would just invite the listeners to not only think about themselves as Ryan clearly did, and to look at the question of whether they feel that, but also look at other people, because again, part of for this to be a movement, we have to think about how we interact with other people. And so even if this doesn't apply to you, clearly some people go through a period of feeling shame or some significant amount of shame, and people can feel shame about themselves. I remember talking to a woman who said, I'm so harsh with other people because once I woke up, I was just mad at myself for not having woken up earlier. And so her way of dealing with her own shame and anger at herself is to be angry with other people. And so even if the shame thing doesn't apply to you, I would encourage people to be broad and think about how it applies to other people. And all of that is in the context of how do we invite other people to move forward. So I love the model, Shelly. I think it's really helpful. And you don't get people out of shame by by telling them don't feel shame and don't feel that. You have to essentially support and love people through it. So yeah, again, brilliant work as usual. And I would just invite people to, if this doesn't apply to you, think about how it applies to other people, because we all all anti-racists matter. And so we need to figure out a way to be more effective inviting other people to move to the good places on the chart and not the more difficult places.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that noticing too about the dips into disintegration or whatnot. It took me a long time to fully grasp the fact that, I still go in and out of these various positions. I love this road map, kind of this roundabout model, because it really gives me the whole chunk in one easy to look at piece. But also I don't let go of Dr. Helm's idea about them being frames, because I sometimes, whenever there is a new concept, I might get thrown right back into contact, because that's a position where I'm thinking, why does race matter in this issue? I don't understand why race matters in this issue. So in that issue, I'm in contact. And in that issue, once I realize, okay, maybe there is something there, then I might be in disintegration too. I'm still trying to figure out, am I really gonna see this as being like influenced by race? Or am I gonna say, no, this is just being made too big to a big deal about? That process is still back to these early positions. It's just an issue-driven position. And then yes, using all that other layers of resources and skills and background knowledge, I can get myself out of that a bit faster. I appreciate you naming that, Ryan, because we're dipping into these positions kind of all the time.
I would say one more thing just to add is that this might be helpful for people. We're all like managing our feeling about certain sort of narratives. So there's a narrative about who we are as individuals. There's a narrative about how the people who influenced us were, and then there's a narrative about the country, right? And so part of the challenge in all this is to hold ourselves with a stance of loving accountability towards ourselves and others. And I would emphasize the loving part of loving accountability. Both are important. And then there's also just holding the notion that like maybe the country's narrative, how do we hold the fact that Thomas Jefferson created some great concepts about the nature of humanity and democracy and was a slave owner. Like, how do we hold both of those? And so because we're so prone towards bifurcated thinking, it's hard to hold that. So it's not shocking that people do what you're talking about, because it is hard to hold on to something can be good and deeply flawed at the same time. And so part of what this model accommodates is how we sometimes can't hold both of those, so we bounce back and forth. And so good on you for this great model. And I would just encourage people to look at how they have struggled with that, or how others that they care about have.
I really appreciate that, because that's a real good reminder of a piece I kind of skipped, and an important part of where we're going next in the next slide is the fact that at the contact position and at disintegration position and at reintegration position, the both and is not terrifically operable, right? This is not really in operation. And the understanding of racism as a system is definitely not in play. We're starting to see it in reintegration, which makes us so angry, but we don't really get the full scope of it necessarily. But here we do not. And that is also what makes the communication really, really troublesome. And that's where we're headed to next, which is what are the dynamics that are keeping people stuck, and a couple of different kinds of stuck. One, I will say, is we've got far-right messages that look fantastic and sound fantastic to people who are recently out of the contact stage, who just want to feel okay again. And we have got anti-racist messages that are both scary to people in those earliest positions, but also being wielded by people in reintegration in ways that are hitting back right in the soft spot of other folks, right? Just in the wrong moments. And so I just want to take a moment to notice how these play against each other. So let's take a look at being colorblind. Colorblind in that context space, that is the American way. Being colorblind is being American, as far as the far right puts it. You can watch Fox News and Tucker Carlson, and as far as he's concerned, just paying attention to race at all is anti-American. And what we are seeing currently as we are recording is the offering of model legislation that is penned by Christopher Rufo, who is the architect of the anti-CRT movement, who has essentially put forward a draft legislation that will be modeled and will be implemented across many states within the next year, that is basically saying that any institution at a public university that speaks to racial consciousness is problematic, and advocating for a return to a colorblind orientation. And they're going to try to legislate this. So in the space of that, we have got an anti-racist message that is very structured within the conflation of white people and whiteness, that says all white people are racist. Now, I understand this language. I use this language all the time. I can speak to my racism even as an anti-racist person. So it's not that I'm disputing the veracity of this, given how I understand it. But it's that second clause that's really important, given how I understand it. And somebody who is in a colorblind position of contact or disintegration does not understand racism as structural and systemic and deeply unconscious in many ways. They understand it as hatred, animosity, that overt dislike of another group. Whereas when somebody is in the reintegration or further, typically understands all white people are racist is, we've all been subject to this socialization. We can't help but have gotten racism under our skin and in our teeth and all over the place, and we just need to get it out. But depending on how healthful we are in navigating the guilt and the shame is the harshness with which we deliver that information. So what we see are back and forth with anti-racists delivering all white people are racist, a lot on Twitter, landing for people who are not prepared to understand what that means. In a similar dynamic, there are people who are, let's say, in disintegration, very upset, very perturbed about the world. Their world is getting ripped out from under them, and maybe are starting to hear about concepts like white fragility and white privilege for the first time. Now, they have a lot of content coming at them that's actually telling them from the far right that these concepts in themselves are racist. In themselves racist because it's telling you that just by virtue of you having a certain color skin that you must be racist, building off of this statement. And then we in the anti-racist community are saying, no, 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 that's exactly the opposite. But the fact that you believe so and you've got all this emotion around it means your privilege or your fragility is actually showing, and we're not going to give you any space or emotional relief here because your emotions should not matter. You really should only be focusing on people of color's emotions. Your emotions pay no attention to them whatsoever. Stop worrying about whether you're a good person or not, because you're a racist person and you just don't know what you're talking about. You need to pay attention to privilege and focus on other people. And
you're censoring yourself.
You center yourself. Exactly. But you can see the challenge here, right? So there's anti-racist messages being given to people who are right at the contact or disintegration status, who are not going to interpret these messages in anything approaching a useful way. So what we then have is in terms of the third dynamic here, and this is just a few, right? This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a few little dynamics that we see playing out all over the place, is that the far right would like to claim that anti-racism shames white people and makes them feel bad. Well, that's not my existence, but grab a bunch of white people, go looking for evidence that that isn't true. Let's scan Twitter and look for evidence that that is actually not true. And it's really hard to find, quite frankly. Anti-racism is going to help us understand that the US is founded on and operates under white supremacy. And I believe that's true, absolutely. And it's also true what David said prior, which is if we can't marry that idea with a balanced approach that says, and some white people did some good things. And in fact, most white people have some mix of some pros and some cons to them, then what we get is the delivered message that every white person in history, if you look closely enough, must be awful and must be canceled. And that ends up amplifying the far right claim that anti-racism is simply shaming for white people and makes them feel bad. So here's the overall nut that I am concerned about. If supportive conversations are not available to white people who are navigating the disintegration process, navigating reintegration, coming out of contact, they are much more likely to look at this scenario, continue to be deeply confused and put off, probably by both of them, thankfully by both of them, because I think people don't want to be on the side of white nationalists, really, but they also aren't going to commit to an anti-racism that seems really extreme and that they don't understand. And it is that apathetic, disengaged, repelled middle that we should be really concerned about, because these are winnable people in our fight. And the far right is consciously going for them, consciously saying, no, come on over here. Let me give you a way to feel better about yourself. And so this situation is really important because so many people in that movable middle ground will end up feeling even slightly inclined towards some of the far right messaging and end up adopting that language. Not to say they want to be on that far right, but as they adopt that, well, there's a point here, it becomes either a false equivalency or it becomes a shield that allows us not to actually really attack what the far right is doing that is deeply, deeply problematic. So we're going to already pause here because that's a lot. And I'm going to, again, pause for about 10 seconds to have you talk to people nearby or journal and reflect. What have been your experiences with these various messages? How have you or people that you know struggled with them? And this is just a little bit of it. I'm sure you can come up with these other phrases that they're now starting to come up, like David saying, yeah, the decentering whiteness thing, like equity versus equality. There's all these different buzzwords that we have in anti-racism that the far right has totally different interpretations of. So let's pause and see what you think about this. Ryan, what do you think?
So it's interesting, when I look back on my life, I didn't have anti-racist messages coming to me until I saw racism. And then I was the one, I still didn't, well, no, that's not true. Okay. I was gonna say, yeah, I did struggle with anti-racist messages, but that was probably after I already had support, you know, I already had an anti-racist community that I could go to and say, hey, I'm supposed to work on myself, but I'm not supposed to center myself. Like, yeah, so confusing. It hit me too, as you were saying that. I'm going to take back hit, but I remember when I was first going through it, that for some reason I recognized early on that I have a lot of racism inside of me, and it is what it is, and I may as well say it because it is what it is. And I know I'm not the only white person doing that. And I don't know, shame is coming up for me a lot, and trying to remember my shame and trying to, I don't know. I feel like I'm not really saying too much right now. A lot is coming up for me, and I'm trying. Anti-racist messages did not push me back into contact or reintegration. It was more my white culture, and it just felt good to go back into reintegration into whiteness. But I don't know. I'm going to be quiet and think more for a second. David, please.
You're fine, Ryan. It's fine. It's very confusing. I'll just say a couple things. So first, the reason that whole anti-racist shames white people make them feel bad, that's because a whole bunch of anti-racist shame people make them feel bad. Like let's be clear about that. Like, part of the problem is that the way, and this goes back to what Ryan first talked about, the way this stuff is delivered, it's not just the message itself, is that people are actually delivering it in a way that seems designed, that has the intention of making people feel bad. So that's number one. And I think that as that's dysfunctional, as we've kind of alluded to. I would also add that some of what people are doing, in addition to what I said earlier, which is they're working out their own shame about themselves by punishing other people, they also have a kind of a weird kind of like a proxy outrage that they've borrowed from people of color, who are perhaps even legitimately angry about all of this. And somehow we, you know, within the both the Twitter world and the actual world of doing anti-racist stuff, that people feel like, well, I was with a Black person who read the riot act to somebody, even another person, a struggling initial anti-racist. So I guess I'm supposed to be mad too. And I do think that honoring that anger by other people has a certain value, but I'm not sure that borrowing it has a certain value. The people who are doing that are angry because of what they've suffered. And so I think that one of the things that people can look at is whether they have taken on by proxy other people's outrage in a way that is not only somewhat unproductive for those people of color to do it, but it's really unproductive for you because you are the person who can reach other people. So I would just say that. I would lastly add that I appreciate what you said about me trying to hold those dichotomies, but I would also invite people to remember that even Max Kendi, somebody who's way a much bigger thought leader than I am, he says that we shouldn't label people as anti-racist or not. We should label actions as anti-racist or not. So part of what's involved in all of this is a kind of an essentializing of people, that you're either racist or anti-racist, when in fact, as Walt Whitman, we are all multitudes, right? That people, it is actions that can be supportive of the structures of racism or dismantling of that. And we all are a mix of people, a mix of the different actions we do, none of us are pure in that. So, so it is complicated. I think that this has a lot of resonance, and my most important thing is I would invite people to, as they think about this, not only think about what are the messages they have heard, but what are the ones that they've delivered to other people in their effort to try to grow the movement. So I would say, Shelly, could you hit the pause button, the actual pause button?
Yes. And what I would like to offer to Ryan is, I remember clearly where you were when you first arrived to Aware, and it was not a very pleasant experience for you going through things. And I wonder if you hadn't had all those conversations with Aware, whether your tender spirit, if you had fallen into another group that was a bit harsher in nature, if it would have gone as well for you as it did.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and my child has brought up to me that these anti-racist messages here, I have said to him and said to my husband, and we've worked through it. And I've had to say, yeah, I wouldn't say it that way now, but I did say it then. And so, yeah, 2 years later, we're working through it.
And I'm glad you're working through it, and you have the relationship where you can. And I think that's part of the point is, we do care about not leaving anti-racists behind. And so you've had a chance to you've had to do some repair work though, and that's the thing for all of us to consider when we are at a point in our identity development where we are self-righteously adopting the anger. It is sometimes more destructive than useful. And I will just name for the record that we are talking today about white racial identity. People of color have a racial identity process as well. It is somewhat parallel, but different, and it deserves to be really looked at, because as David was talking about, it's not just about righteous and legitimate anger, it's also about a healing process for oneself too. On people of color side. And so just as we can pay attention to where white people are in their racial identity development, there is also a parallel process to attend. David, did you want to say something else before I go on?
Just the old comment that we need to be hard on the problem, but easy on people.
I love that, thank you. So what is this workshop trying to advocate for? Essentially, it's the idea that we actually need, especially white people who have been coming out of contact, moving through disintegration, in reintegration, we need ourselves and we need for others to have a vision of something that is like this autonomy vision, something that is going to allow us a positive place for us to know that we can land someday, where there is a good feeling that comes at the end of this, that all the hard work is worthwhile, that it isn't all about feeling bad. And so, although we aren't spending a lot of time on it today, pseudo-independence position is an anti-racist position. It's just a position where there isn't as much deep self-reflection. It's a lot of upset at society. It's a lot of feeling good about self for being upset with society or doing something we think is going to be making the difference. Often the picture of pseudo-independence is sort of the white savior idea, where it's not very self-reflective, but it's very much those other bad people, those other bad racists need to be stopped. This is not necessarily a positive position to circle in. I think I spent years in this position, so I understand it well, unfortunately. Probably the most optimal, the immersion is an important position. This is really about learning. We are immersing ourselves, we are studying ourselves, and we are doing action. So we are not centering ourselves navel gazing, we are doing the back and forth flow of learning something and trying something new, and then learning something and trying something new. And that is ultimately what can help land us in a more skilled location, a more centered location that allows us to be operating out of autonomy at various points and hopefully for longer and longer periods of time. And what autonomy looks like is having developed something akin, whether you use this language or not, it is a positive anti-racist identity. It is a sense of self, of being stable and grounded and feeling okay about who you are as an anti-racist person who has developed the kind of both and thinking that David talking about, that allows for nuanced understandings, that allows us to take the good, let go of the bad at different points, to see the complexities, find a place within them where we can stand and keep moving forward with imperfection and not falling apart because of it. In this place, we understand that white people do not equal whiteness, that it's okay to be white. We just want to be a good kind of white person who is anti-racist in nature. We understand that whiteness as a system needs to be dismantled, but we do not have to attack other white people. And all of this allows us to replace a good chunk of that guilt and shame that existed in those earlier positions with much more joy. We can show up to anti-racism with a sense of joy. We can understand that liberation for the collective is really an important thing. And we can actually feel good about ourselves, that it's okay for a white person to feel good about themselves. That is not the same thing as a white nationalist, white pride. And we can be clear about that. And we need this kind of beacon of hope so that we can throw the kind of party that other people want to come to, right? And what is a key feature of this is the collective idea that everyone, even white people, need healing from racial socialization, that whiteness does not love anyone. It might privilege white people, but it still does so to our spiritual and emotional, and sometimes even our livelihoods, undermining. We are better off if we dismantle whiteness, every single one of us. And we need to heal from the destruction that it has wrought. And knowing all of that allows critiques not to land so hard, quite frankly, because we know where we're situated with all of this. We can take on the parts that are ours to own. We can let go of the parts that are deep, old stuff that maybe we're a part of, but isn't all about us. And it allows us to recover much more readily when we think we're in autonomy. Somebody gives us a big old boot and we go, oh, dang, what does this all mean? And then we can do a little bit of thinking and then get back in. That's what we're hoping for. That's what we want to be able to model. That's what we want to be able to point to say, this is what lies ahead. And how is it that we can get there? Practice, 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 practice. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with saying something needs practice, because everything we do needs practice if we want to be skillful at it. And if we use sports or the arts, anything that we do that we take up as a hobby, we aren't good at it just because we decide we want to be good at it. Anti-racism is no different. If we want to be good at the game, we show up to the practices. If we want to be good at the performance, we go to rehearsals. And so anti-racism, we need to practice it too, but we need to practice it in community. And so having a loving, generous community that is all looking toward developing a positive sense of self in our anti-racism is critical. And what's equally critical is knowing it's not just any community. I invite you to consider how important it is to align with people who are operating out of autonomy, operating out of a position that is not just harshly combating other people, a place that isn't just naming other people as wrong without having done their self-inquiry, and a place that isn't only about you're always and ever going to need to study, and why are you always wrong no matter what? Because there are people who have really spent a lot of good time delving deeply, but still never get to that place of feeling okay. And so they're always willing to say, I must have done something wrong. I must always be wrong. And I'm not allowed to feel good about myself until I find it. That too is a place where we need a little bit of healing from. And I say equivalent here, align with people operating from autonomy or the equivalent, because again, people of color are under their own journeys as well. And so finding people who can really demonstrate the ability to work across race, who are in that position of holding love and gentleness for all people, I would say attached to that until you have generated sufficient supports that you can actually handle working with people who may not be exactly there. Because we do need to continue to make solidarity partnerships with people regardless of their healing process. But let's take care of our putting on our oxygen masks first. You know what I mean? Or else we can't actually be supportive to others. And just a last point here, in terms of being able, the usefulness of this tool for me is being able to kind of name, oh, I see what this position offers. This is what's going on here. How do I shift out of it? The ability to have anti-racist role models that are not only people of color, but also white people for white folks, that typically is showing up here in immersion or immersion. Doesn't really show up in the earlier positions. And what it allows for is a more balanced orientation toward growth and action. So those are just some key markers to think about. Again, I do think this is a necessary beacon of hope. Again, to go back to the beginning, what we are in is a situation where white identity is extremely meaningful now in ways that it was not before. And the going narratives out in the world are either that you need to be colorblind or we need to dismantle whiteness. These are the two largest frames that have the attention. We know that the white nationalists, it's best to be white. We're not as worried about the movable middle taking on that one as much. But what has become much less amplified is not new. This is not new material. It just has gotten less attention under the Twitterverse and under the harsh lights of the large narrative going on in the nation for the last 5 to 10 years. There is room and there's theoretical structures and there is backing for us to say that a positive anti-racist white identity is important, it is useful, it is essential for young people, and it's especially essential for young people if we're going to have them battle against the white supremacists who are trying to recruit them. So, all of that said, in the meantime, while we ourselves are trying to navigate around these positions and move ourselves into a position where we can be whole, healthy people trying to get as close to autonomy as possible, the value of this structure as an orienting tool is that when we study it, we can learn to recognize typical thought patterns and we can see something coming a mile away. I can talk to somebody for about another white person for about 5 minutes and be able to figure out which of the frames they're most likely using. And I know a whole bunch about that person through it. I don't know everything and I still need to do my investigation, but I can pretty quickly figure out what would be another move if they're right here and I'm trying to figure out how to get them here. It's a different conversation than someone's right here and I'm trying to get them to move here next, right? And quite frankly, like Ryan, we met you here, a little bit here, and we moved you right over to here. You did not spend time in pseudo-independence. And that was a beautiful thing. Now, that doesn't mean you never spent moments there, but it certainly wasn't the years that I spent there. And I think having a community makes that big difference. Because when we can identify other people's positions, we can understand what the impact of our engagement patterns are going to be. And we can help to facilitate people moving through the process a little bit better. Because as we also can identify our own positions, we can mindfully choose our responses as well. All of that becomes possible. And this is the last pause. I'm going to invite our discussant and Ryan to do one last share, but only after you have had a chance to sit and kind of process these questions. What is your reaction to this idea that a positive anti-racist identity is a beacon of hope and that it's a necessary guiding roadmap, or that it can be at least? So again, I'm going to pause for about 10 seconds and then we'll continue the conversation to finish up. Ryan?
Yeah, I would say that for the first year of my anti-racism journey, I was, even though I had so much support, I would say I was still kind of miserable. Like I didn't feel joy. I was still so much in guilt and shame. I didn't feel joy until I had been in anti-racism for a year. And now, it just feels like this is who I am and this is life, and I'm back to myself again, and it does feel so good. And I think that also allows me to go from, one status to another real quick and then pop back out into the main circle again or wherever I am. But like there's a forgiveness that I have and a much less perfectionism that I have now that I understand the way you have the roundabouts and stuff. And so it just helps me go with more forgiveness and more health. And I guess I'm in this for the long run anyways, but yeah, it feels really nice to have a healthier mindset about it and to have some joy and to feel like myself again. And it was not easy despite all the support I had. So beacon of hope. Yes. I wish this for everyone, and the roundabout helps me a lot.
Thanks, Ryan.
So before I make any comments, I want to ask Shelly, if you could just say a little bit more. I almost did this before the pause. Could you say a little bit more about the distinction between the pseudo-independence and immersion? Maybe I had a kind of a brain issue, but if you could.
No, that's okay. I didn't linger on it long. The pseudo-independence is exactly what those words sound like. It's pseudo false, independence, kind of confidence about where we're situated. So pseudo-independent people in that position, it feels like I know everything I need to know. I got it handled. I'm the anti-racist who's been doing this work for 10 years. I know everything I need to know. And those are the wrong and bad people. Right? Usually there has not been a self-evaluation to understand how I myself am related to whiteness, how I myself have racism within me, because the pseudo-independent sees themselves as properly anti-racist with usually not having done that self-critical work. So they're often the ones who are going to show up at a nonprofit ready to, take over without really understanding how they're stepping on toes, that sort of thing. And the immersion is a position of deep self-inquiry. So I'm looking at myself, I'm trying to understand about myself, how am I related to whiteness? Usually when we spend enough time in there, we are developing those relationships with others, starting to develop solidarity partnerships, starting to do the kind of action that is helping us gain our skills, and therefore the guilt and shame is lessening quite a bit.
Are the pseudo-independent people still shaming other white people?
Yeah. Pseudo-independence is still marked by a lot of guilt and shame. It's just often less acknowledged.
Gotcha.
Yes.
So thank you for that. I think that'd probably be helpful for listeners.
Yeah.
So as we have discussed many times, a lot of my focus is on how white folks can give useful, compassionate tune-ups to other white people, or at least to engage them in ways that are helpful to their journey. And so, I love the fact that your model essentially includes that, because some of what you talked about the emergent is about that, is in addition to some really important work you said about the self and hope and pride and joy. And because I think that the movement needs to be fun, people, if you want to invite people to it, just like Shelly said. Like, you can't, like, if it's all dour, nobody wants to do that, right? So I would just say, I would offer something that I have a tool, which is like a 2-question tool about like how people deal with other anti-racists. And so I would just say one hallmark potentially of the emergent, I think is compatible, even though I hadn't thought about it in those terms, is you got to ask yourself the question: when other people say racist stuff, what's the degree to which you like have a really visceral reaction to it, a visceral emotional reaction that's kind of hard to get hold of, and what's the degree to which you actually decide to engage that person? Because, and what you want to be is somebody who doesn't have a visceral reaction, but still engages them, right? That's what you want to be. And that's of course going to be most effective if it comes from a place of compassion, a place of appreciation, a place of I've been there too. Not only I've been there too, I'm still like you in some ways, right? So, but I might be at a slightly different point. But so I would just offer to people that, as you know, not that we're doing it for the cookies, we're not doing it to get the points, but just to this one indicator or set of indicators is what how often what happens when other people show their racism, and how much what do you do, what happens inside of you and what happens behaviorally. I think that's a useful thing to think about. I think I think that this model is a beacon of hope, and I think we need people who will own the fact that, as I said before, we're all sometimes supporting racist structures and sometimes countering them, as we're all multitudes. And what we want to do is to move our behavior so that we're more often countering those structures and less often supporting them. But it's whether you think Jesus is true or a construct, then we're never going to be perfect like he's supposed to be. So we're always moving toward that, because we're in a system that incentivizes us over and over and over to support the racist structures. And so we need to look at our actions necessarily and not necessarily our essential being. And so what I love about this is that it puts up the idea of us always moving towards being a better anti-racist. And that essentially, that idea is that vision that I think is really important, and that it makes this part of what makes this model so powerful. So thank you so much for your great work, Shelly. And I hope that people take it on, and I hope that people read your upcoming books about it, because your contribution is so valuable. And I appreciate the chance to have been here for this, and look forward to helping you spread your work, because it's so vital for this movement.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning that. In fact, in order to wrap up, to know how to contact both myself and or David, because David has amazing resources as well at his website. So there is an email and website for David and myself. Please feel free to be in touch. You can subscribe to a monthly newsletter to get all sorts of updates. And yes, this presentation is built off of the new book, Being White Today, A Roadmap for a Positive Antiracist Life. You can see that QR code to get taken directly to the page on the website for that. And there's so much more. And so I thank you for your attention here. Look forward to being in touch in our wider anti-racist community spaces. And Ryan and I can be found at Aware LA Saturday Dialogues. And so if you go to awarela.org and sign up for a dialogue, you got a pretty strong chance of happening upon one of us in any of those dialogues. So I am going to wish you all good faith and good fortune. And thank you for being with us.